Look at that. A black beggar woman sitting outside a $40 million estate like she's waiting for an invitation. Carter Hargrove said it loud enough for both sponsors beside him to hear. Loud enough to carry across the gravel drive. Loud enough to reach the woman sitting on the overturned wooden crate outside the iron gate. He pulled a handful of quarters from his jacket pocket and threw them not toward her, at her. Hard, like skipping stones. Here you go, sweetheart. Buy yourself something warm. The coins scattered across the gravel. One rolled and stopped at her shoe. The old black woman on that crate didn't flinch. Didn't look up. One of the sponsors, a man in a $3,000 suit who had shaken hands with senators, cupped his mouth and called out, "Hey, what's the going rate for a black woman's dignity these days? Looks like about 35 cents. The other one laughed so hard he spilled his bourbon. Then Carter reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, crumpled it slowly into a ball, and threw it directly at her face. It bounced off her cheek. "That's more than your grandmother ever earned in a month. Pick it up, or don't. Either way, you're still sitting in my dirt on my property in front of my gate, and you always will be." The old black woman on that crate still didn't flinch, didn't look up, just kept turning that cracked leather rein slowly in her hands, around and around, like she was the only person in the county who wasn't in a hurry. Then, without raising her voice, without lifting her eyes, she said, "The black stallion in stall 12. He hasn't touched his feed in 4 days. Tonight's the night he goes through that door, and nobody on this property knows how to stop him but me." The laughter died. Carter Hargrove stood at the top of those stone steps with a fistful of quarters and a smile that had just stopped working. Because she was right. And he had told no one. This woman sitting in the dirt wearing a coat held together by 2 remaining buttons, she knew the one thing Carter Hargrove had spent a week trying to hide from his sponsors, his staff, and the racing commission. Stay with this story. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching this. And if this is the kind of story that moves you, subscribe. Because what happens inside those gates over the next 11 days will change every single person who witnessed it. Hargrove Hill. Equestrian estate sat on 650 acres of rolling bluegrass in Lexington, Kentucky. The kind of place that didn't need to advertise itself because everyone already knew what it was. The main entrance was flanked by white oak trees that had been standing since before the Civil War, their branches arching overhead like a cathedral roof, leading up to a clubhouse built from Tennessee limestone with 14-foot ceilings, hand-cut crystal chandeliers in every room, and a bourbon bar that stocked bottles older than most of its staff. The portraits in the trophy corridor told the story the Hargrove family preferred. 6 oil paintings floor to ceiling, each one a white man in riding attire, each one wearing the same expression, the particular look of a person who has never once questioned whether they deserved what they had. At the end of the corridor, a glass case held 17 championship trophies. Brass, gold-plated, heavy enough to use as a weapon. Out back, past the manicured hedgerows and the private grandstand, with its navy velvet seats, the stables stretched in 2 long rows of polished white oak and wrought iron. 54 stalls, thoroughbreds worth more than houses. Grooms in pressed uniforms moving quietly between them, speaking in low voices, keeping their eyes down the way people do when they've learned that being noticed is rarely a good thing. The racial geography of Hargrove Hill was never written in any employee handbook. It didn't need to be. The grooms were black. The stable hands were black. The women who braided manes at 4 in the morning and cleaned stalls before the owners arrived were black. The jockeys who got their names in the racing programs, who stood in the winner's circle for the cameras, who received the handshakes and the bonus checks, they were white. That wasn't policy. That was just how things were, how they had always been. and in a place like Hargrove Hill always was considered good enough. Carter Hargrove ran all of it. 41 years old, with the kind of tan that comes from yacht weekends rather than outdoor work, hair always perfectly placed, custom Florentine riding boots that cost $6,800 a pair and never once touched actual mud. He arrived at the estate 3 or 4 days a week by helicopter because the drive from his home in Versailles felt beneath him. He spoke to his staff the way some people speak to appliances briefly when something wasn't functioning the way it should. Carter had not built Hargrove Hill. His father Thomas had. Thomas Hargrove spent 30 years transforming a modest breeding operation into one of the most decorated equestrian estates in the American Southeast. When Thomas died of a heart attack in 2019, he left Carter everything: the land, the horses, the name, the reputation, and the comfortable assumption that inheriting something was the same as earning it. Carter had won races since then. 3 stakes titles, 2 regional championships. But he won them the way men like him always win, by spending more, demanding more, and quietly removing anyone who threatened to outshine him. Now he had a problem that money for once was struggling to fix. His name was Shadow Gospel. The stallion in stall 12 was pitch black from nose to tail, 17 hands tall, and built with the kind of muscular density that made experienced horse people take a full step back the moment they saw him. He had arrived at Hargrove Hill 8 months ago from a breeding farm in Virginia with a reputation that preceded him by several area codes. In his first week, he had kicked through the back wall of his stall. In his second, he fractured the wrist of a trainer with 30 years of experience who had simply reached for his halter at the wrong angle. A second trainer lasted 11 days before the stallion threw him into the iron feed rack hard enough to crack 2 ribs. A third quit without collecting his final paycheck. A fourth lasted 4 hours. The veterinary team was divided. Half of them recommended sustained heavy sedation until after the race. The other half had begun using the word euthanasia in their reports quietly, carefully, the way people mention something they believe is inevitable but aren't yet ready to say out loud. Carter refused both options, not out of any particular attachment to the animal, but because Shadow Gospel was without question the fastest horse he had ever owned. The Hargrove Hills Invitational was 11 days away, a $2.1 million purse, national television coverage, his father's legacy on the line in a way that made Carter's jaw tighten every time he thought about it. Shadow Gospel was the only horse in his stable capable of winning that race. And then there was the woman outside the gate, Nadine Bellows, 64 years old. She had been sitting on that overturned wooden crate outside the main entrance every morning for 4 weeks. She never begged, never asked for food or money, never spoke to anyone unless they spoke first. She simply sat, hands wrapped around a cracked leather rein with aged brass fittings gone green with decades of weather and wear, and she watched the horses through the iron rails. Sometimes her lips moved, not to herself, toward the horses. Words too quiet for anyone to catch. The stable grooms thought she was harmless. The jockeys thought she was odd. Carter thought she was an eyesore that reflected badly on the estate every time a sponsor's car came up the drive. But Lily Hargrove Carter's 22-year-old daughter and the estate's junior jockey had noticed something the others either missed or chose not to see. Every time Nadine whispered, the nearest horses changed. Ears rotated toward the gate. Breathing slowed. One gray mare had pressed her entire face against the iron fence and stood motionless for 4 minutes, as if she were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Lily mentioned it to her father once. Carter told her to stop romanticizing stable animals and focus on her riding. So Lily said nothing more, but she kept watching. And at the far end of the trophy corridor, between the 5th and 6th oil portrait of a Hargrove man who had never once doubted his own importance, there was a framed photograph. A black woman, young, standing tall beside a magnificent horse. The brass nameplate beneath it had been filed completely blank. No name, no date, no record that this person had ever existed. Nobody at Hargrove Hill talked about that photograph. Not yet. It started the morning after Shadow Gospel put his shoulder through the reinforced stall door for the third time in a week. Carter was in a foul mood. He had spent the previous night on the phone with his insurance broker, then with his head trainer, then with a specialist from Lexington, who told him things he didn't want to hear. He had not slept well. He had not eaten breakfast. And when he stepped out onto the limestone terrace, with two sponsors, men who had each written six-figure checks into the Hargrove Hill operation, and expected a return on them, and saw Nadine Bellows sitting on her wooden crate outside the iron gate, something mean and restless in him decided to have a little fun. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handful of quarters. "Watch this," he said to the sponsors. The first coin hit her shoulder. The second landed in the gravel 2 feet to her left. Carter adjusted his angle and threw the third one harder directly at the wooden crate where it rang against the edge and spun into the dirt. The sponsors laughed. One of them tried. Then the other. They turned it into a competition who could land a coin in the small tin cup sitting by Nadine's feet. Quarters, dimes, half dollars ringing off the cup's rim and bouncing into the gravel around her shoes. Nadine did not move, did not react, sat like a woman who had learned long ago that the safest response to certain kinds of men was to become, as far as they were concerned, part of the landscape. Carter upped the stakes. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. He held it up so both sponsors could see it. Then he crumpled it slowly, deliberately, into a tight ball and threw it at Nadine's face. It bounced off her cheek and fell into her lap. "That's more than your grandmother ever earned in a month," Carter said. "Pick it up, or don't. Either way, you're still sitting in my dirt, sweetheart." One of the sponsors, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who sat on 2 hospital boards and donated annually to a literacy foundation, cupped his hands around his mouth and called out across the gravel. "Hey, what's the going rate for a black woman's dignity these days?" "Looks like about 35 cents. The other sponsor laughed so hard, he spilled his bourbon over the terrace railing. Nadine looked at the crumpled bill in her lap. Then she looked at Carter. Her expression was steady, unbothered in a way that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with a woman who had survived things these men would never understand. One of the younger stable hands standing nearby raking gravel kept his eyes on the ground, and his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Carter didn't like that look. The steadiness of it. Men like him could handle anger. Anger meant you'd gotten through. Steadiness meant you hadn't. He snapped his fingers at the 2 security guards stationed by the gate. "Get her off my property. I'm tired of looking at her every time I walk to my own stables." The guards moved quickly the way people do when they've learned that hesitation costs them. They took Nadine by both arms and pulled her to her feet. Her wooden crate scraped against the gravel. Her canvas bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the ground hard, the flap falling open, contents scattering a folded cloth, a small tin of beeswax, and the cracked leather rein, with its aged brass fittings, spilling out onto the gravel in the morning light. Carter picked up the rein. He turned it over in his hands the way a man examines something he has already decided is worthless. He ran his thumb along the cheek piece where letters had been carefully, painstakingly stitched into the leather in dark thread. He didn't bother reading them. "You stole this from somebody's barn, didn't you?" He held it up for the sponsors to see. "Look at this. 30-year-old tack she's been carrying around like it means something." He tossed the rein into a puddle near the gate. It landed with a soft, flat splash, the brown water closing over the stitched inscription. That was the moment. Not the coins. Not the $50 bill against her cheek. Not the hands on her arms, or the laughter ringing across the stone terrace. It was the rain landing in the puddle, the quiet, indifferent splash of something irreplaceable being discarded, that broke something in Nadine Bellows's face. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, dry and steady all morning, went wet. Not tears. Something older than tears. The kind of pain that doesn't live in the eyes, it lives in the bones. The guards dragged her past the gate and pushed her onto the road outside. Carter turned his back and walked toward the clubhouse, already looking at his phone. Nobody noticed Lily. She had been standing by the water trough at the side of the stable block, watching the entire scene with her fists pressed against her thighs and her knuckles white. She was 22 years old, and she had grown up in this place, and she had watched her father be cruel before small cruelties, casual cruelties, the kind that powerful men perform the way other people perform breathing. But something about this morning was different. She waited until Carter disappeared through the clubhouse door. Then she walked to the puddle, crouched down, and pulled the rain out of the water with both hands. She wiped the mud off carefully, slowly, the way you handle something that matters, even when you don't yet fully understand why. She turned it over, found the stitched inscription on the cheekpiece. Read it. She who is quiet moves the mountain. Something moved in the back of her mind. A connection she couldn't quite place. She looked up at the trophy corridor windows across the courtyard. Somewhere inside, between those oil portraits and that blank nameplate, a story was waiting to be found. She tucked the rein inside her jacket and walked away. That same evening in the housekeeper's cottage at the edge of the property, Ruth Calloway sat by her window and watched the coins still glittering in the gravel where they had fallen. She was 78 years old. She had worked these grounds for 44 years. She had seen owners come and go, fortunes made and squandered, injustices buried so deep beneath limestone and bourbon and old money that most people forgot there was anything buried at all. She had not forgotten. Under her bed, in a locked cedar box that had not been opened in 26 years, the truth was still waiting. She wasn't going to wait much longer. It happened 3 nights later. Shadow Gospel had been deteriorating steadily since the incident with the stall door. He refused grain, refused hay, refused the specially formulated feed the veterinary team had ordered from a supplier in Lexington at considerable expense. He paced the length of his stall in tight circles, hour after hour, his shoulder hitting the reinforced steel door on each pass with the mechanical, joyless persistence of a prisoner who had stopped believing in escape but hadn't yet found a reason to stop trying. On the second night, he kicked the cast-iron water trough clean through the stall window. 600 pounds of iron moving through the air like it was made of cardboard. The sound woke every horse in the east wing and brought 3 grooms running from their quarters at midnight, breathless and barefoot, only to find the trough in the yard and Shadow Gospel standing in the center of his stall, trembling, watching the hole he had made in the wall with something that looked almost like grief. By the 3rd night, every light on the estate was on. Carter stood 50 yards from stall 12, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching the veterinary team argue in low, urgent voices by the equipment trailer. The head vet, a careful man named Dr. Philip Okafor, who had been working thoroughbreds for 22 years, wanted a heavy tranquilizer enough to bring Shadow Gospel down for 8 hours, enough time to get him stabilized and reevaluated in the morning. His assistant pushed back hard. The dosage required for an animal this agitated, this size, could stop his heart if his system was already stressed. A 3rd vet, the youngest, quietly suggested calling a specialist from the University of Kentucky's equine program. "No outsiders," Carter said. "Whatever happens tonight stays on this property. Give him the shot." Dr. Okafor picked up the tranquilizer rifle. His hands were not entirely steady. Inside stall 12, Shadow Gospel hit the door again. The top hinge gave a sound like a gunshot. Metal fatigue. One more impact and the door would come off entirely. 1,600 pounds of terrified stallion loose in an enclosed stable block at midnight, with nowhere to go but through whoever was standing between him and open air. Lily was behind the hay barn 30 feet from the east stable entrance, standing in the dark, with her back against the wooden wall and her eyes closed. She had heard what this horse did to the last trainer who got within 10 feet of him. She had heard the sound of that man's wrist breaking from across the paddock, a sound she had spent 3 weeks trying to forget and hadn't managed yet. She did not want to be anywhere near stall 12 tonight. She was about to go back to the house when she saw it. A shadow moving along the south fence. Slow, deliberate, no flashlight, no hesitation. A figure slipping through the gap where the drainage culvert had rusted the iron rails apart. A gap barely wide enough for a slim person to turn sideways and squeeze through. Lily had known about that gap for 2 years. She had mentioned it in a maintenance report. Nothing had been done. The security camera mounted on the south fence post was recording. Its red indicator light blinked steadily in the dark. Later, when investigators reviewed the footage, they would note something they couldn't explain. The camera captured the empty fence, then the open yard. Then Nadine already halfway across the grass, as if she had materialized from the darkness itself. The gap, the fence. The moment of entry, none of it appeared on the recording. The camera had been functioning perfectly. Nobody had an explanation. Nobody in the official report tried very hard to find one. Nadine Bellows walked across the open yard toward stall 12, the way a woman walks into her own kitchen after a long day. No urgency, no hesitation. As if the screaming metal and the shouting vets and the 50-yard perimeter everyone else had instinctively maintained were simply not relevant to her particular errand. Lily opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Nadine reached the stall door. Shadow Gospel was on the other side, slamming his full weight against it, in 3-second intervals, the steel buckling outward, with each impact like the chest of something trying to breathe its way out of a too small cage. Nadine placed both palms flat against the door, closed her eyes, and she began to whisper. Nobody could hear the words. Not Lily, pressed against the hay barn wall with both hands over her mouth. Not Dr. Okafor, who had lowered the tranquilizer rifle and was staring with the expression of a man watching something that was reorganizing his understanding of his own profession. Not Carter, who had finally noticed the figure by the stall and was already shouting for security in a voice that kept losing its authority every time it left his mouth. The words were not for any of them. The slamming stopped. Not gradually. Not winding down. It stopped the way a phone stops ringing when someone finally answers, immediate, complete the silence, after it's somehow louder than the noise had been. Dr. Okafor lowered the rifle the rest of the way. Nadine unlatched the stall door. Every person in that yard stopped breathing. Lily's fingers found the fence rail beside her. The rust cut into her palm. She didn't notice. The door swung open. Shadow Gospel stood in the center of the stall. His muscles were still trembling, fine, rapid tremors visible beneath the black coat even from 30 feet away. His neck was dark with sweat. His eyes, which had been white-rimmed and wild 10 seconds ago, were fixed on Nadine with an expression that had nothing to do with rage. It looked like recognition, the particular recognition of someone who has been alone in a dark place for a very long time and has just heard a familiar voice through the wall. Nadine stepped inside. She did not raise her hands, did not reach for the horse. She angled her body sideways, dropped her left shoulder, and slowed her breathing until her chest barely moved. Every motion precise, deliberate. Ancient, the word that came to Lily's mind, without her choosing it, and which she would use again later when she tried to describe what she had witnessed. Nadine whispered one more time. Shadow Gospel's knees bent. His front legs folded. And the horse that had broken 5 handlers destroyed a stall wall, put a cast-iron trough through a window, and brought a 22-year veteran to the edge of recommending euthanasia. That horse knelt on the straw floor of stall 12 like a cathedral. Nadine pressed her forehead to his muzzle. "I know, baby," she said softly. "They forgot you, too." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The youngest vet's clipboard was on the ground. She didn't remember dropping it. Ruth Calloway, standing in her cottage doorway 200 yards away, pressed both hands over her mouth and closed her eyes. And Carter Hargrove, standing in the floodlit yard with his security guards arriving uselessly behind him, looked at the old black woman kneeling beside his horse in the straw. He did not see a miracle. He turned to his assistant and said very quietly, "Find out everything about that woman. I want it on my desk before sunrise." Carter's people found nothing. They searched every database available to a man with money and no patience for procedure. Racing commission records going back 30 years, county court filings, social security lookups, a background check service that charged $4,000 per query and claimed access to records most people didn't know existed. Carter's private investigator, a former state trooper named Dale Wicks, who had handled sensitive matters for the Hargrove family since 2008, spent 18 hours running searches and came back with the same answer every time. Nadine Bellows did not exist. No license, no address, no employment history, no criminal record, no racing registrations, no property records anywhere in Kentucky, Virginia, or Tennessee. It was as if someone had reached into every filing cabinet in the American Southeast and pulled her name out by the roots, leaving nothing behind but clean paper and empty fields. That made Carter angrier than the kneeling horse had. But anger doesn't win races, and the Hargrove Hills Invitational was now 9 days away. Shadow Gospel had calmed considerably since that night in stall 12. He ate. He drank. He stood without agitation when the grooms entered to clean. But he would not accept a rider. Every time a jockey climbed into the saddle, the stallion locked all 4 legs and refused to move with the absolute, immovable certainty of an animal that has made a decision and has no interest in discussing it. One rider tried using his heels. Shadow Gospel had him off and against the paddock fence before the man's second attempt landed. The horse was waiting for something. Everyone on the estate understood this at some level. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant admitting that a 64-year-old black woman sitting on a wooden crate outside the gate was the only solution to a $2.1 million problem. On the 6th morning, before the Invitational, Carter Hargrove swallowed what remained of his pride, which wasn't much, but the swallowing still cost him and sent Lily to the gate with an offer. Nadine was back on her crate. Nobody knew how she kept returning. Security removed her every morning. By the next dawn, she was there again, same crate, same coat, same cracked leather rein, turning in her hands, as reliable and unmovable as the iron gate itself. Lily delivered the message without embellishment. Carter would pay $8,000 cash for Nadine to work with Shadow Gospel through race day. No contract, no official record, no questions about her background or her history on this property. Nadine listened without interrupting. She looked past Lily at the estate, the white oak allée, the limestone clubhouse, the stable rows she knew better than Carter Hargrove ever would. Then she looked at Lily directly in a way that made the young woman feel simultaneously seen and ashamed without understanding exactly why. "I don't want his money," Nadine said. Lily blinked. "Then what do you want?" "After the race, Shadow Gospel goes to sanctuary. Real land. A creek if possible. Nobody puts a whip to him ever again. I want that in writing, signed by your father, witnessed and notarized, before I set foot through that gate." Lily brought the terms back to Carter. He read them, poured himself a bourbon, and said fine. He signed the document that afternoon with the casual indifference of a man signing something he has no intention of honoring. The notary was his personal attorney. The witness was his assistant. Neither of them asked questions. That was what he paid them for. Nadine entered Hargrove Hill Equestrian Estate through the main gate the following morning for the first time in 26 years. Ruth Calloway was waiting at the stable entrance. She had asked Carter's permission to be present for the initial session, citing 44 years of institutional knowledge and a responsibility to estate operations. Carter had waved her off without looking up from his phone. She took that as a yes. When Nadine came through the gate, Ruth was standing by the stable door with a set of keys in her hand. Their eyes met across the courtyard. 26 years of distance collapsed in the space of a breath. Ruth opened her mouth. Nadine shook her head barely. The smallest possible movement. A language built from decades of knowing each other. Not yet. Ruth handed her the keys and walked away without a word. The training began the next morning, and it looked like nothing anyone at Hargrove Hill had ever seen or expected to see. Nadine did not bring a whip, did not bring spurs, did not raise her voice above a murmur at any point during any session. On the first morning, she walked into Shadow Gospel's stall, carrying only the old leather rein, and instead of fitting it to the horse, she hung it on the hook by the door. Then she sat down in the straw. She sat there for 90 minutes. Shadow Gospel watched her from the far corner. He paced. He snorted. He came within 4 feet, then retreated. Came within 2 feet, stopped, retreated again. The grooms watching through the stall slats held their collective breath so consistently that one of them later said it felt like the longest church service of his life. At the end of the 90th minute, Shadow Gospel lowered his nose and pressed it into Nadine's open palm. She breathed out slowly, matched his rhythm, her inhale meeting his exhale, her exhale meeting his inhale, until the two of them were breathing in the same time signature. Then she stood, lifted the rein from the hook, and held it open beside his head. Shadow Gospel dropped his chin into it, like he had been waiting for exactly this. An older black groom named James, who had worked these stables for 23 years and had seen 4 professional trainers leave this property in varying states of injury, turned away from the stall slat and wiped his face with the back of his hand. He didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. By the 3rd day, Nadine had Shadow Gospel on the training track. No saddle, no rider. Voice commands only. She walked him through the full circuit from the rail, including Widow's Curve, the dangerous downhill banking, where the track dropped sharply left, and most horses tensed, shortened their stride, fought the angle. Shadow Gospel took it at a smooth canter, ears forward, responding to nothing but the sound of her voice. The jockeys watching from the grandstand didn't speak for a long time. On the 4th day, Nadine found what 5 veterinarians and 3 professional trainers had missed entirely. She was running her hands along Shadow Gospel's right foreleg, in the slow, deliberate way of someone reading something written in a language only her fingers understood, when her hands stopped. She pressed. The horse flinched, barely, just a ripple of muscle beneath the skin. But Nadine's face changed. "Stress fracture," she said to Dr. Okafor, who had come to observe. "Right splint bone, 2 inches below the knee." The vet stared at her. "We radiographed that leg 3 weeks ago. The films were clean. Radiograph it again." They did. The fracture was there. A crack so fine it was almost invisible on the screen, but real and serious enough to end the horse's career permanently if he ran on it at full speed without intervention. Nadine fashioned a therapeutic wrap from muslin beeswax and a binding technique she had developed and refined over 30 years of working alone. Dr. Okafor watched her work from start to finish without speaking. When she finished, he looked at the wrap for a long moment, then looked at her. He had no words. There were none that would have been sufficient. That evening, Carter changed the locks on the stable block and told the head groom that Nadine's access was restricted to supervised daylight hours only. And then he went to find Lily. Carter found Lily in the tack room. She was cleaning bridles, the kind of repetitive, focused work she retreated to when she needed to think, and she didn't look up when he came in. She had learned early in life that not looking up sometimes bought her a few extra seconds before whatever was coming arrived. It didn't buy her enough tonight. Carter leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and his voice at the temperature he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. "I've noticed you spending time with the woman," he said, "following her around the stable block, sitting with her at the rail during training. I've had 3 people mention it to me this week." Lily kept her hands on the bridle. "She's doing good work with Shadow Gospel. I thought it made sense to. I didn't ask for your analysis." His voice dropped 1 degree. "I'm telling you something. One more time, I hear you're following that woman around, talking to her outside of race preparation, treating her like she's something other than a temporary contractor, and you're off this property, off my payroll, out of the invitational, out of the will." He paused to let that land. "You'll have the same amount of money and opportunity as she does. You want that?" Lily looked at the floor. "No, sir." "Good." He pushed off the doorframe. "Get some sleep. You've got morning training at 6. She listened to his boots on the stone floor until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat without moving for a long time. Ruth had slipped a key into Lily's jacket pocket that afternoon during a brief, unremarkable exchange near the kitchen entrance, a movement so practiced and quiet that Lily hadn't been sure it happened until her fingers found the key an hour later. There was no note with it, no explanation. Ruth had simply looked at her for one long moment, with the eyes of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for the right person to be ready, and then walked away. The archive room was at the back of the trophy corridor. Nobody used it. It smelled of old paper and cedar, and the particular stillness of a place where things have been put away with the intention of never being retrieved. Lily unlocked it at 11:15 that night, turned on the single overhead bulb, and stood in the doorway looking at floor-to-ceiling shelves of labeled boxes and filing cabinets with drawers that hadn't been opened in years. She found the box on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. 1994 to 1998, estate records internal only. Inside, beneath a layer of racing programs and administrative documents, she found the photograph. It was large 8 by 10 professionally printed mounted on backing board. A black woman in her late 30s, standing tall and straight, beside a magnificent horse the color of dark water. The woman's chin was lifted. Her eyes were direct. She was holding a leather rein in both hands with the quiet, settled confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged and had never required anyone else's confirmation of it. The horse beside her, a mare deep brown with a white star above her left eye, was perfectly still, her head turned slightly toward the woman, as if caught mid-conversation. At the bottom of the photograph, a brass nameplate had been fixed to the backing board. Nadine Bellows, the gentle rein trainer of champions. Beneath the photograph, a second document, a racing program from 1997, the Hargrove Hills Invitational. In the trainer's column beside a horse named Still Water, the name had been cut out with something sharp. A razor blade or a box cutter. Clean, deliberate, thorough. Whoever had done it had not been angry. They had been careful. Lily held the photograph in both hands. Her own last name was on the gate outside on the trophy case in the corridor on the championship. Banners above the grandstand. And the woman who had made the name worth having had been cut out of a racing program with a razor blade and filed in a box labeled internal only. She put the photograph inside her jacket. The next morning, she found Nadine at dawn sitting on a hay bale behind the east stable watching Shadow Gospel graze in the early paddock light. The stallion moved differently now, head low, stride unhurried, tearing grass with the slow contentment of an animal that had rediscovered what peace felt like. Lily didn't say good morning. She pulled the photograph from her jacket and held it in front of Nadine without speaking. Nadine looked at it for a long time. Her own face, 26 years younger, looking back at her from beside a horse that had been dead for 2 decades. She didn't deny it. She didn't explain. She exhaled the long, slow release of a breath held for longer than any person should have to hold one. "That was a different life," she said. "You're the gentle rain," Lily said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "You trained still water. I looked up the records last night, the ones that still have your name on them before someone went through with erasure. Training logs, breeding assessments, race preparation notes going back to 1991. Your work is on everything. And then after 1998, nothing. Like you stopped existing." Nadine nodded slowly. "That's about right." "What happened?" Nadine was quiet for a moment. She watched Shadow Gospel pull at the grass. She watched the morning light move across the paddock in long gold strips. And then she told Lily the story she had not told anyone in 26 years, because until this particular morning, there had been no one left who was worth the telling. She had arrived at Hargrove Hill in 1991, at 38 years old, with a gift she had never been able to explain, and a way with horses that made people stop what they were doing and stare. Thomas Hargrove hired her as a groom. Within 8 months, she was working with young horses. Within 2 years, she was the most discussed horsewoman in Lexington. They called her the Gentle Rain because she never raised her voice, never used a crop, never forced an animal into anything. She asked, and the horses answered. Still water was her masterpiece. A premature foal with underdeveloped lungs and joints so weak, the veterinary team gave her a 10% chance of surviving her first winter. Nadine took the foal into her own quarters, slept beside her on straw for 4 months, fed her by hand every 3 hours through 2 Kentucky winters, and nursed her into a mare that went on to win 7 consecutive stakes races and become the most decorated horse in Hargrove Hill history. The Hargrove name went national on the back of that horse. The money came. The television contracts came. The magazine covers came. The invitations to the kind of rooms where real power sat and made decisions over bourbon and handshakes. All of it built on the partnership between Nadine Bellows and the animals she had given her life to. And then Thomas Hargrove decided he didn't want to share credit with a black woman. The night before Stillwater's 8th championship race, a syringe of EPO was found in Nadine's locker. Thomas Hargrove called the racing commission himself. The hearing lasted 50 minutes. Nadine had no attorney, she couldn't afford one, and not a single lawyer in Lexington would take her case against Thomas Hargrove's money. Thomas brought 4. The commission revoked her license before the end of the afternoon session. She lost the license. Then the cottage on the estate. Then her savings fighting a legal appeal no one believed in. Then her husband, who left 18 months after the hearing, because watching someone you love be destroyed systematically is its own kind of unbearable. Then her daughter, Ezra, who was 14 years old the last time Nadine held her standing in the driveway of a cousin's house in Louisville, watching the car pull away. When a powerful man decides you don't deserve to exist, Nadine said quietly, the system doesn't ask questions. It just signs the paper. Lily had tears running down her face. She didn't wipe them. "Why did you come back?" she asked. Nadine looked at Shadow Gospel in the morning light. "Because he's Stillwater's grandson, the last living thing in this world that carries my work inside its blood. And they were going to kill him." Before Lily could respond, a voice cut across the yard like something thrown hard. "What exactly is going on here?" Carter was standing at the stable entrance. Behind him, two men in dark suits carrying briefcases. His eyes were on the photograph in Lily's hand. Carter crossed the yard in 12 steps. He took the photograph from Lily's hand without asking the same casual, proprietary motion he used when taking anything he considered his by default. He looked at it for 3 seconds. His eyes moved from the image to Nadine and back the way a man cross-references a face with a file he thought he'd destroyed. Then he smiled. Not warmly. The way a man smiles when he believes he has just identified a problem he already knows how to solve. "The gentle rain," he said. "My father mentioned you once. A stable girl who got ideas above her station and had to be reminded of her place." He held the photograph up briefly like evidence at a low-stakes trial. "Convicted doper. Racing license revoked. My father caught you personally. I believe that's in the commission records if anyone wants to look." He said it lightly, conversationally. "The way you mention something unpleasant that is nevertheless settled and no longer worth significant emotion." Nadine said nothing. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was the same face she had worn outside the iron gate when the coins were flying steady present and completely beyond the reach of anything Carter Hargrove had in his arsenal. Carter turned and walked toward the clubhouse. "Get security. I want her off the property before the sponsors arrive." "That is a lie, Carter." The voice came from behind him. Quiet. Absolute. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it has something better than volume. It has certainty. Carter turned. Ruth Calloway was standing in the stable doorway. 78 years old, white hair pulled back from a face that had seen 44 years of Hargrove Hill mornings. She was carrying the locked cedar box from under her bed. Both hands. Steady as foundation stone. Her eyes were not angry. They were something more dangerous than angry. They were decided. She walked to the outdoor table near the stable entrance, the one the trainers used for paperwork and the vets used for consultations, and set the box down. She opened it with a small key on a chain around her neck. The box had been locked since 1998. The documents inside had been waiting longer than some of the people in this yard had been alive. Ruth placed the first document on the table. Original laboratory reports from Stillwater's final 3 races. She smoothed the paper flat with one hand. Clean. Every single one. No prohibited substances. No irregularities. Signed and dated by the independent testing laboratory contracted by the Racing Commission, not by Hargrove Hill, not by Thomas Hargrove, by the Commission itself. Carter's smile was still in place. Thinner now, working harder. Ruth placed the second document on the table. Internal memorandum from Thomas Hargrove to the estate's head veterinarian, Dr. Claudette Marsh. Dated February 14, 1998. 16 days before Stillwater's 8th championship race. She paused. Instructing Dr. Marsh to obtain a quantity of EPO and place it in Nadine Bellows's locker prior to the pre-race stable inspection. The yard went quiet. Not the quiet of people being polite. The quiet of people whose breathing has changed. Carter's smile stopped working entirely. Ruth placed the third document on the table. She placed it the way you place a gravestone, with both hands, with weight, with the understanding that what you are setting down is permanent. Notarized confession, signed by Dr. Claudette Marsh on March 3, 2022. Witnessed by a licensed notary in Jefferson County, Kentucky. Ruth's voice did not waver. Dr. Marsh was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in January of that year. She died on March 19, 2022, 16 days after signing this document. She could not die with it on her conscience. The yard was not just quiet now. It was hollow. The kind of silence that exists not because there is nothing to say, but because language has momentarily failed everyone present to produce it. 6 grooms standing along the stable wall. 3 jockeys who had come out for morning exercise and stopped walking when Ruth began speaking. Dr. Okafor by the equipment trailer, a coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. Lily with both hands pressed flat against her sternum, as if trying to hold something in. And in the clubhouse doorway behind Carter, 4 sponsors, 2 racing officials who had arrived early for a pre-invitational compliance inspection, and a television producer from the network broadcasting the race, who had come for what she expected to be a routine pre-event interview, and had instead walked into something she immediately understood was the most significant thing she would witness in her professional career. She had her recorder out before Ruth finished the 3rd sentence. Carter's face went through several changes in quick succession. The smile collapsed. The skin beneath his tan went pale, then flushed dark red across his jaw and neck. His hands at his sides closed into fists and then opened again in the unconscious motion of a man whose body is looking for something to do while his mind tries to locate an exit. "Those are fabricated," he said. His voice had lost its temperature. "That woman has been on this property for 30 years with access to the archives, and she has—" "Sit down, Carter." The senior racing official, a woman named Patricia Hensley, who had overseen commission compliance for 19 years, and had the particular stillness of someone who has seen powerful men unravel before and found it neither surprising nor interesting, said it from the clubhouse doorway. Calm. Absolute. Not a suggestion and not a request, and not the beginning of a negotiation. Carter Hargrove sat down. One sponsor stepped back into the clubhouse and began making a phone call in a low, rapid voice. A second sponsor picked up her bag and walked to her car without speaking to anyone. The television producer moved closer to the table, her recorder steady in her hand, her face professionally neutral in the way of someone who has learned to keep their reaction out of their work. Lily was standing beside Nadine. At some point in the last 2 minutes, she had moved there without consciously deciding to. Their arms were almost touching. Carter looked at Nadine across the table. For the first time since she had arrived outside his gate 4 weeks ago, he looked at her the way you look at something that has the capacity to end you. She looked back at him with the same steady, unhurried expression she had worn when the coins were landing in her lap. And Carter Hargrove, who had spent his entire adult life engineering outcomes, who had never once accepted a result he hadn't controlled, who had inherited an empire and a set of tactics for protecting it that went back 30 years, Carter Hargrove understood, in the space of a single breath, that he was out of moves. So he made the only move he had left. That night, at 3 a.m, 2 figures in dark work clothes appeared on the widow's curve with tools and a flashlight. The work took 40 minutes. 2 men, neither of them employees of Hargrove Hill, both of them men Carter had used before for matters that required discretion, and no paper trail moved along the inside rail of Widow's Curve with practiced efficiency. The flashlight was kept low, pointed at the ground. The tools were simple. A socket wrench, a pry bar, a level to confirm the posts still looked plumb from a distance, 5 fence posts on the sharpest section of the downhill banking. Each one loosened at the base plate, the bolts backed out just enough to leave the post standing perfectly upright, perfectly normal in appearance but structurally compromised. A horse hitting that rail at racing speed from the inside would feel the post give on first contact. By the second contact, the base plate would separate entirely. The post would collapse outward, opening a gap in the rail at the exact point where the track dropped 6 feet down a concrete drainage embankment. The men checked their work from 30 yards out. The posts looked untouched and were off the property before 3:45. Carter had also entered a second horse in the invitational that morning. Copper Ridge, a solid chestnut gelding with legitimate credentials, and a jockey named Marcus Fenn, who had ridden for Hargrove Hill twice before and currently owed Carter a significant personal debt that made certain conversations easier than they might otherwise have been. Marcus received his instructions in a phone call at 10 that night. 11 minutes. No recording. Carter's instructions were precise and left no room for misinterpretation. Stay on the outside through Widow's Curve. Let whoever is running inside take the rail. Come home in second if necessary. Second was acceptable. Second was clean. Second did not raise questions. Shadow Gospel was meant to die on that track. And if the investigation that followed looked for a cause, it would find Nadine Bellows, an unlicensed, unregistered woman with a revoked record and no legal standing to be on the property at all, standing at the center of every question. Carter poured himself a bourbon at 11:30 and went to bed. Nadine was awake at 5. She walked the track alone in the gray pre-dawn light. The grass dark with dew. The grandstand empty and vast above the rail. The starting gate standing at the far end of the straight, like a row of held breaths. She had walked a track on every race morning for 30 years, not as superstition, as practice. The way a surgeon checks the room before the procedure, not because anything is likely to be wrong, but because the cost of missing something that is wrong is too high to accept the alternative. She walked the full circuit in 22 minutes. The straight, the first turn, the back stretch, the second turn. She was almost past Widow's Curve before her feet slowed. She stopped, crouched down, pressed her palm flat against the ground, the way she had pressed it against Shadow Gospel's stall door 3 weeks ago. The soil at the base of the first post was disturbed. The grass around it was pressed down in a pattern inconsistent with weather or foot traffic, deliberate directional, the signature of a tool applied at an angle. She leaned her shoulder against the post. It shifted. Barely less than a centimeter, but it shifted. She checked the next post. The next. The next. The next. All 5. Nadine stood up straight and looked down the curve toward the drainage embankment 6 feet below. She stood there for a long moment, with the morning coming up, gray and cold around her, and the weight of what she was looking at sitting in her chest, with the particular heaviness of something that is not a surprise but is still, despite everything, a grief. She had come back to this property to save a horse. She had not come back expecting anything from the men who ran it. She had not come back with hope exactly, but she had, perhaps somewhere beneath the practical and the guarded, carried the quiet belief that there was a floor, some lowest level below which even Carter Hargrove would not go. She had been wrong about that floor. She walked to Ruth's cottage at 5:45 and knocked twice. Ruth opened the door immediately. She had not been sleeping. Nadine told her 2 things. She needed every security camera on the property, confirmed recording, before the first race. And she needed 1 camera, the one on the south grandstand post, repositioned to cover the full length of Widow's Curve. Ruth nodded once. She already had the maintenance keys in her hand. Nadine found Lily in the jockey's room at 6:30. The young woman was sitting in front of the long mirror, in her racing silks green and gold. The Hargrove colors, the colors of a name that meant something different to her this morning than it had a week ago. Her helmet was on the bench beside her. She was staring at herself in the mirror with the expression of someone who does not entirely recognize the person looking back at them. This was her first major race. She had trained for it for 2 years. She had wanted it with the specific, focused hunger of someone who has grown up in the shadow of something large and needs to prove to herself more than anyone that she belongs in the light. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't buckle her chin strap. Nadine sat down beside her on the bench. She did not speak immediately. She looked at Lily in the mirror for a moment, not at the silks or the nerves or the Hargrove name on the jacket, just at the young woman inside all of it. Then she picked up the helmet, buckled the chin strap herself, with quiet, steady hands, and set it back on the bench. She said one thing. At Widow's Curve, you go wide. All the way wide away from the inside rail. No matter what the other riders do. No matter what instinct tells you. No matter what anyone told you in the briefing room. You go wide. Lily looked at her in the mirror. Why? Because I need you to trust me the way that horse already does. Lily held her gaze for a long moment. Outside, the grandstand was filling. 18,000 people settling into seats, unfolding programs, checking the odds. The television trucks were parked along the north fence cables running across the grass like roots. The invitational was 3 hours away. Lily stopped shaking. Okay, she said. The gates opened at noon. 18,000 people filled the Hargrove Hills grandstand, under a sky the particular shade of blue that only exists over Kentucky in late spring. The bourbon was flowing in the clubhouse boxes. The television cameras were live along the rail. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders in the cheap seats. Women in wide-brimmed hats studied their programs with the focused intensity of people who had done their homework. The announcer's voice rolled across the infield like weather. 8 horses lined up in the starting gate. Shadow Gospel stood in gate 3. Pitch black from ear to tail, absolutely still, his breath rising in small clouds in the cool air. Lily sat in the saddle, with her hands quiet on the reins, and her eyes on the track ahead. The horse beneath her felt different from every other animal she had ever ridden. Not calmer exactly, but more present, more deliberate, as if he had made a series of considered decisions about this morning and was prepared to honor them. Copper Ridge stood in gate 6, Marcus Fenn low in the saddle visor down, already measuring the first turn with the quiet calculation of a man who knows exactly what he is there to do and has made his peace with it. The bell rang. The gates flew open, and 8 horses hit the track simultaneously in a single explosive percussion of hooves and breath and 18,000 voices rising at once. Shadow Gospel broke clean, off the gate like something released rather than started his stride, opening up immediately to its full reach, the power in his hindquarters, driving forward with a fluency that made the 2 horses flanking him look like they were working considerably harder for considerably less. By the first turn, he was in second half a length off the leader. By the back stretch, he had moved to the front. Lily did not force it. She sat still and let him run. She matched her breathing to his the way Nadine had taught her, not directing, accompanying. Shadow Gospel's ears were forward. His head was level. He was not fighting the bit or the pace or the weight on his back. He was simply running with the whole body commitment of an animal that has remembered what it was made for. The commentators were already stumbling over their words. Copper Ridge sat in 4th, Marcus Fenn, patient, unhurried, watching the field arrange itself around him the way it needed to arrange itself. He was not riding a race. He was managing a position. There is a difference, and experienced jockeys feel it in the reins. The field came out of the second turn, and the announcer's voice lifted with it. Widow's Curve was ahead. The track dropped downhill here, banking left at an angle designed to test balance and commitment simultaneously. The fastest line, the line every instinct and every hour of training pointed toward, was tight against the inside rail. Hugging the curve, minimizing distance, carrying speed through the banking. Every jockey in the field felt the pull of that line the way a needle feels north. Lily felt it too. She heard Nadine's voice instead. She moved Shadow Gospel 3 full lanes out from the inside rail. The shift was decisive, unhesitating, a choice made before the curve arrived, honored completely when it did. It cost her 3/4 of a length. The horse who had been running second swept past her on the inside, taking the natural line, ears back, running hard. The crowd groaned. The commentators questioned the move in real time, their voices carrying the polite bewilderment of people watching something they don't yet understand. Marcus Fenn held the outside. He knew exactly where the danger was. He had known since the phone call at 10 the night before. He gave the inside rail a wide, careful berth and told himself it wasn't cowardice, it was strategy, and spent the rest of the curve not quite believing that. The horse in fifth position didn't know. He hit the first compromised post at 41 miles per hour, running the inside line with full commitment, his jockey asking him for everything he had through the banking. The post gave on first contact, that barely perceptible give that a horse at speed processes as wrongness in the fraction of a second before the second contact arrives. The second contact came immediately. The base plate separated. The post collapsed outward. The horse's front legs caught the gap in the rail at full stride. He went down hard and fast the way large animals fall with terrible momentum, and a sound that cut through 18,000 voices and silenced every single one of them in the same instant. His jockey, a 26-year-old man named Derek Sousa, married 8 months. His wife in the grandstand, in the third row, went over his neck and hit the track shoulder first, then rolled, then stopped moving. The horse behind him swerved, clipped the next post, and that post went too. A second horse down, a second rider thrown, ambulance sirens from the infield, track marshals sprinting, the announcer's voice losing its professional composure for the first time in 11 years behind a microphone. The race did not stop. The steward's flag stayed down. 4 horses were still running. The crowd was not cheering anymore. It was something else, a collective held breath, a communal state between horror and desperate hope. 18,000 people watching 2 things at once and not knowing which one to follow with their eyes. Marcus Fenn surged forward as the field thinned. He pushed Copper Ridge hard through the chaos, moving to the front of the remaining group, and then cut sharply across Lily's line on the final turn. Deliberate, calculated, forcing Shadow Gospel toward the inner rail, where one remaining compromised post waited at the turn's apex. Lily felt the pressure and reacted the way any jockey reacts to being boxed. At speed she pulled left, then corrected right, the adjustment too sharp, the rhythm breaking underneath her. Shadow Gospel felt the confusion through the reins and responded to it immediately, his head coming up, his stride shortening. The wildness that Nadine had spent 9 days quietly dismantling, beginning to reassemble itself in his eyes. In the grandstand, Nadine gripped the rail with both hands. She closed her eyes. She whispered. Nobody around her heard the words. The noise in the grandstand was enormous, the aftermath of the falls, the surge of the remaining race. 18,000 people processing shock and excitement simultaneously. Whatever Nadine said was absorbed immediately by all of that sound and disappeared. Except it didn't disappear. 200 yards away, running at full speed on a track still marked by what had just happened on the curve, surrounded by the thunder of other horses and the roar of a crowd that had just witnessed something terrible and was now witnessing something else entirely. Shadow Gospel's ears turned toward the grandstand, toward the rail, toward her. His stride steadied. His head dropped back to racing level. The tension that had been rebuilding in his neck and shoulders drained away with the suddenness of a decision made and honored. Lily felt it beneath her. The settling, the certainty returning. She released the reins, not entirely kept the contact, kept the communication, but she stopped pulling, stopped directing, stopped being afraid. She trusted the horse, completely. The way Nadine had trusted him since the first morning she sat in the straw and waited for him to choose. Shadow Gospel accelerated. 3 strides, and he was level with Copper Ridge. 5 strides, and he was a neck ahead. Marcus Fenn drove hard, asking everything from his horse the whip, working the crowd noise surging as the finish line came. But Shadow Gospel had something no whip could manufacture. He had 9 days of patient, unhurried belief running through his muscles, and the sound of a familiar voice still moving through him like a second heartbeat. He crossed the finish line 5 lengths clear. The grandstand erupted. Track officials alerted by Nadine before the first race directed to Widow's Curve by the repositioned camera Ruth had arranged at dawn were already on the rail when the race ended. They found 5 compromised posts. The camera footage was time-stamped and clear, 2 figures, 3:08 in the morning, tools visible, work, methodical and deliberate. Carter Hargrove was standing in the winner's circle when the officials began walking toward him through the crowd. Shadow Gospel crossed to the fence at the rail's edge and pressed his muzzle through the gap toward the grandstand. Toward Nadine, she stepped forward, pressed her forehead to his, closed her eyes. Around them, one person in the grandstand began to clap a single pair of hands in 18,000, then 10, then 100. Then the sound rose and rose until it was indistinguishable from the earlier roar, but was something entirely different in its nature. Not excitement, not reaction, but recognition. 18,000 people applauding something they couldn't fully name but could feel in their chests like a second pulse. Nadine didn't open her eyes. "We made it home, baby," she said softly. "We made it home." They arrested Carter Hargrove in the winner's circle. Not in a back office with lawyers present and a quiet agreement about optics. Not through a representative, not with a courtesy call the night before. Not with any of the professional discretion that money usually purchases in situations like this. They walked up to him in front of every camera on the property, in front of his sponsors, and his staff, and his daughter, and 18,000 people still buzzing with the aftermath of the race, and they told him he was being detained pending formal charges. Carter said nothing. His mouth opened once and then closed again. He looked for the first time in anyone's memory like a man who had run completely out of performance. The charges came in sequence over the following 48 hours. Track tampering, conspiracy to cause bodily harm, animal endangerment, fraud. The 2 injured jockeys, Derek Sousa with a fractured shoulder blade and 3 broken ribs, the second rider with 2 fractured vertebrae, provided statements from their hospital beds. Their lawyers were making calls before the afternoon was over. Marcus Fenn cooperated immediately and completely. He had made his calculation before Carter's lawyers had finished their first cup of coffee that morning. The debt he owed Carter Hargrove, it turned out, did not extend to criminal liability. He gave a full account of the phone call, the instructions, the deliberate positioning at Widow's Curve. His statement was 7 pages. He signed it without revision. Carter's racing license was revoked before sunset. The same commission, the same single-page process, the same swift institutional certainty that had destroyed Nadine Bellows in 50 minutes 26 years ago. Only this time the evidence was not manufactured. This time no one had planted anything in anyone's locker. This time the documents on the table were real, and the woman they described was standing in the room, and the man who had put her there was the one being led away. Ruth's documents did the rest. The Racing Commission opened a formal review of Nadine's 1998 case within 24 hours of the confrontation in the stable yard. They had Dr. Marsh's confession, Thomas Hargrove's internal memo, and the original clean lab reports. The review took 72 hours. On the 4th morning after the invitational, the commission issued a formal statement. Patricia Hensley read it at a press conference. Her voice was even and unhurried. The charges filed against Nadine Bellows in February 1998 are hereby vacated in full. Her racing license is restored with immediate effect. The Commission acknowledges a profound and deliberate failure of justice enabled by institutional complicity and the willful suppression of exculpatory evidence. We offer our unreserved apology to Ms. Bellows, and we commit to a full review of the systemic conditions that made this possible. It was 3 paragraphs. It was 26 years too late. It was nevertheless real and permanent, and on the record in a way that no one could file in a box and label internal only. The nameplate in the trophy corridor was replaced 4 days after the race. Lily did it herself. She drove to a trophy shop in Lexington the morning after the commission statement and had a new brass plate made same dimensions as the original, same font, same weight. She came back to the estate that afternoon with a screwdriver and Ruth beside her, and she fixed it to the photograph backing board in the corridor with her own hands in full daylight, while 3 grooms and 2 jockeys watched from the doorway without being asked to leave. Nadine Bellows, the gentle rein trainer of champions. Nobody said anything when she finished. The corridor held the particular silence of a space that has been corrected, not healed entirely, not made whole, but set back toward true in a way that everyone present could feel as a physical thing. At the press conference following the commission statement, Lily stood in front of a microphone with the invitational winner's trophy on the table beside her. She had prepared remarks. She did not use them. She said one sentence. "I won on Saturday because a woman named Nadine Bellows taught me what that horse already knew, that the quietest strength always outlasts the loudest cruelty." She stepped back from the microphone. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then it wasn't. Nadine declined everything they offered her. Head trainer at Hargrove Hill declined. Consulting position with the Racing Commission's new equity review panel declined. 3 separate stable operations in Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee called within the first week, offering contracts with salaries that made the people delivering them visibly uncomfortable to speak out loud. Nadine listened to each offer with the same patient courtesy she had brought to every interaction since the morning she first appeared outside the iron gate. She said no to all of them. She wanted one thing. 2 weeks after the invitational, a horse trailer pulled up to the Hargrove Hill main gate at 6 in the morning. Nadine was waiting. Shadow Gospel walked out of stall 12 for the last time across the yard, where coins had once been thrown at the woman, now holding his lead rope past the stable block, where 5 trainers had failed to reach him. Through the main gate that she had entered for the first time in 26 years, with a set of borrowed keys and 30 years of silence sitting on her shoulders. He followed her into the trailer without hesitation. No sedation, no blindfold, no restraint. He walked where she walked, the way he had walked since the first morning she sat in the straw and waited for him to decide. They drove 4 hours southeast to a 240-acre equine sanctuary in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Rolling meadows, a spring-fed creek that ran cold and clear through the center of the property, white birch fencing, no starting gates, no grandstands, no whips on hooks by the stable doors. The sanctuary director met them at the entrance road. She had already named the new rehabilitation program a course for rescued horses, animals broken by industries that had treated them as inventory rather than living things. Nadine would visit twice a week. She asked for no salary, no title, no office. Only that the animals be treated the way she had always treated them, with patience, with voice, with the understanding that trust is not a technique, but a relationship. And relationships require time. Ruth Calloway retired the following month. 44 years. She walked out the service entrance on a Tuesday morning with a cardboard box containing a coffee mug, 2 framed photographs, and a small succulent she had been growing on her windowsill since 2003. The estate gave her a commendation certificate in a gold frame. She thanked them politely, drove home, and hung it in her bathroom. She told her daughter it was approximately where it belonged. But she did not leave bitter. She left the way people leave when they have done the thing they stayed to do. The cedar box was empty. The envelope had served its purpose. The truth had outlasted the men who buried it, the way truth, given enough time and the right pair of hands to carry it, generally does. Carter Hargrove's trial began 8 months later. Track tampering and the associated charges were only the beginning. Investigators who entered the estate records as part of the criminal proceedings found 3 decades of suppressed documentation, underpaid black stable workers whose wage complaints had been filed and then quietly closed, injury reports altered to avoid commission scrutiny, breeding records falsified for insurance purposes, and a pattern of racially discriminatory hiring and housing practices so consistent across 40 years that the estate's own attorneys eventually stopped contesting the characterization and focused instead on the sentencing guidelines. Carter received a 6-year racing ban and faced criminal prosecution that his legal team acknowledged would take years to resolve. He had no public comment. His helicopter sat on the pad behind the limestone clubhouse for 4 months before it was repossessed as part of the asset proceedings. The estate was placed under independent management. The Hargrove name stayed on the gate. The power behind it was gone, and then 3 weeks after the race on a Tuesday morning in early June, a woman drove through the sanctuary gate in a rental car and parked at the top of the meadow road. Ezra Bellows was 40 years old. She had seen her mother's face on the news the morning after the invitational on the screen of her phone in a hotel room in Atlanta, where she was attending a work conference, and she had recognized her immediately, despite the 26 years, despite everything. She had sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time before she moved. Nadine was in the lower meadow with Shadow Gospel when she heard footsteps on the grass behind her. She turned. Mother and daughter stood 12 feet apart in the morning light. Neither of them spoke. The distance between them was not 12 feet, it was 26 years. A courtroom in Lexington, a driveway in Louisville, a car window, a 14-year-old girl's face receding as the car pulled away. It was all of that, and it was also, in this particular moment, just 12 feet of Virginia meadow grass and morning air, and a horse standing quietly between them, like a breath held for a very long time, finally carefully released. Nadine did not move toward her daughter. She waited the way she had always waited, the way she had sat in the straw of stall 12, and let the frightened animal decide until Ezra crossed the distance herself. When she did, Nadine put both arms around her and held on. Shadow Gospel stood beside them without moving. His breath rose in the cool morning air. The mountains behind them were green and enormous and unhurried. The creek ran somewhere below, cold and clear, the way water runs when there is finally nothing blocking its way. She who is quiet moves the mountain, and she had. They threw coins at her, called her nothing, filed her name out of existence. And the whole time she was the one who built everything they were so proud of. Talent like hers doesn't expire. Dignity like hers can't be revoked. The truth she carried for 26 years outlasted every man who tried to bury it. Drop a comment if this story moved you. Tell me where you're watching from and what you're carrying that the world hasn't seen yet. And if you believe that quiet strength is the most powerful force there is, subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.